Welcome to Building the Future. I'm your host, Kevin Horick. You can find the show online at buildingthefutureshow.com or follow me on Twitter at BuildingShow. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, and YouTube. Welcome back to the show. Today we have Lior Tamir, an entrepreneur, advisor, founder, and CEO of Accomplice. Lior, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to doing this. You have quite an impressive background, and maybe we should start off with where you grew up.
Sure. So, I was originally born in Israel. It's a tiny little country in the Middle East that always gets attention for the wrong things. But, immigrated to the United States when I was 5, and I settled down in the Bay Area. So I grew up in Foster City, and that's definitely had a huge influence on, just being around the tech community, how I kind of got involved.
Sure. So how did you guys end up in kind of the Bay Area?
It's an interesting story. My mother used to run the rehab unit in the main hospital in Hadassah in Jerusalem, and my dad's brother was a commando in the 1981 Lebanon War, and he was injured. He ended up being in a coma, and he was my mom's patient. At the time, my dad was serving in the military, but he was based in San Francisco, translating mechanical engineering books from English to Hebrew.
Oh wow!
And so he was based out here during that time. When his brother got injured, he went back to Israel, and actually that's how my parents met. But then, they settled back down. They got married. Once we were born, I have a brother and a sister as well. There's continued, troubles in Israel in terms of violence and so on. And in 1991, there was the Gulf War. After the Gulf War, my parents decided that was enough, and that they were going to leave and immigrate to the United States. And when they did so, my dad had most of his contacts here in the Bay Area, and so it was just the only place that he knew people, and that was the reason we ended up here. So totally by random chance. Sure.
So no, that's awesome for you, especially being an entrepreneur.
Yeah. Well, it's changed a lot. I think over the last 10 years, the entire Bay Area. Bay Area has always been known. Silicon Valley has always been known as the tech capital, but it's only become more and more pronounced, and so it worked out. It worked out great. I owe a lot to my parents.
Sure. No. So I'm curious. Then, before we kind of get into your startup and what you were doing, you started off kind of as a jazz musician. Do you want to kind of tell the listeners kind of how you got into playing jazz?
Sure. So it's another one of those funny stories. My dad was a professional musician for many years, and growing up, the things that were important to my parents in terms of values to instill in us, one of the big ones was music. So instead of I didn't really play soccer or sports or things of the sort. I had to play music. I didn't really have much of a choice growing up. More and more so, that became more than just a hobby, and I ended up getting to the point that I could play decently well. I remember I had an instructor when I was in high school who forced me to try out for the state jazz band, and he forced me is key there, because it just really didn't seem like that was going to become my career. I ended up trying out. I ended up becoming the lead alto saxophone player for the state jazz band, and ended up doing some tours and playing with some pretty impressive musicians, and that became more and more the theme. And when I ended up going to college, initially my core focus was around music, and by that time I had already spent a lot of time not just performing, but also in recording studios, mastering studios, working with audio engineers, and I was really fascinated by that entire space. I got into school, and there was an accident that happened in my personal life that kind of got me to take 2 steps back and rethink where I wanted to go with my life. And I decided that music was great as a hobby, but not necessarily a career. And that's when I switched over to the sciences.
Right, and that's when you became a dentist, or does that come later?
Yeah, so it's a few. that was a few steps. So. When I left, music as my core focus, I really ended up doing a lot of work and studying genetics. So I went to University of the Pacific in Stockton, California, And they have an amazing program for music. They also have an amazing program for just the sciences and also the dental school. So University of Pacific Dental School is the top clinical school in the nation. It's based here in San Francisco, and it was just kind of a natural progression. I ended up studying genetics at University of Pacific undergrad, and when I got out, my Jewish mother got on my case, and dentistry at the time seemed like the most logical next step. And I ended up applying and going to dental school to become a dentist. So that was the next step there.
So once you finished dentistry, how long were you a dentist for?
So dentistry has played a really important part of my life. Actually, my business partner and I, used dentistry essentially to not only establish ourselves, but also get to the point that we had some capital that we could invest into ventures that we wanted to. Practicing dentistry, I spent essentially as soon as I got out of school. So I graduated and I had finished all my clinical work and was licensed, ready to go by the end of 2009. At the time, there was, the economy was still kind of in a slump, and I was also extremely young in terms of when I finished. I was able to do all of that and finish by the time I was 23.
Oh,
and
wow.
So, I've always rushed things, not necessarily something that, I wish I could go back sometimes and have taken more classes around the arts and just things that interest me. But at the time, I just wanted to get through things. So I ended up wrapping up with school, and I was practicing part-time, just on a limited basis for many years. At first I was practicing maybe 3 days a week, then it became 2 days a week, then 2 days every other week, and so on, until I kind of established my entrepreneurial ventures and kind of was able to to set the dentistry aside. So I practiced on a part-time basis for maybe 3 or 4 years, and now occasionally I'll go into an office, but I don't practice anymore.
So then how did you get into technology, and what was kind of the driving factor to make you say, you know what, I really want to pursue this and move out of dentistry?
I would never, put myself in a box and say I was just a dentist or just a musician or just an entrepreneur. I think, since the earliest days in my life, business and just being an entrepreneur was kind of ingrained in me. My parents were entrepreneurs. In many aspects. I mean, they came to the United States with nothing, 3 kids and 5 suitcases, and that was a huge risk. But even in terms of business, my mom continued and ended up working at Stanford here, running their rehab unit. But my father always was an entrepreneur, starting businesses, and I learned a lot from that. And so, at an early age, I was already, whether it was selling things on eBay or selling my services, I was always an entrepreneur, and technology had also been a very important component of that. So, at an early age, I was taking computers apart, putting them back together, providing just general services in terms of getting systems set up. So, technology was always a very important component of being an entrepreneur, I guess in my case. When I was in dental school, so the last year and a half, it was right around then that I really started, thinking about, okay, well, what's next, and what do I really want to do with my life? And I started getting involved more so in the tech community and just technology in general. And I'd helped. I did a little bit of work helping a team get a travel app going. I also had my own e-commerce store that I ran out of my apartment at the time. And when I got out of dentistry, as I mentioned, the economy was kind of in a slump. It was very difficult to get work as a practicing dentist, especially because in terms of my family, I didn't have any dentists that that were already established that I could go and get a job in an office. So technology, entrepreneurship became the only way to move forward. Technology was the area that I felt was where I could make the most impact, but also really pursue what was truly driving me, and that was kind of how I decided to go down that path. Now, in terms of being a technologist, I very much so understand the complexities of the different technologies that are available. I don't necessarily code myself, but it was a very conscious decision at the time, looking at what were my options, where was the economy growing, and just the general markets, and saying, okay, I really want to pursue and kind of spend my time and effort in technology.
No, I think that's awesome, and it sounds like you've had a passion for it for a number of years before you even started kind of anything really technology related, or like at least full time. Right out of becoming a dentist, or while you were still practicing being a dentist, did you start Accomplice, or kind of when did you start that up?
Sure. So Accomplice is, I would say, is my fourth tech venture. So Accomplice only came about we're about 2.5 years old now. But before I was building Accomplice, there was a few other ventures that that I had pursued. The one immediately before Accomplice was essentially a social listening platform. And at the time, this was kind of in the early days of social listening, before it became a lot more commoditized. But we were working on helping brands and marketers take vast amounts of text, so unstructured data, and be able to make sense of it. So using all kinds of data processing and natural language processing algorithms to kind of look at vast amounts of text, be able to process it and spit it back out in a way that a marketer, whether it's a brand marketer or someone working on a content strategy, could kind of slice and dice a conversation to better understand the qualitative insights. It's interesting because when I took that to market, we were working with brands like Warner Music Group and Atlantic Records, and one of the things that we learned from this process was they were able to find really great and substantial insights from our solution, but taking those insights and then applying it to one sort of marketing effort, whether it was putting together a content strategy or better developing an audience for paid media efforts, that was kind of where the gap lied always with what we had brought to market and what the market really needed. And so at the time, what we had decided to do was essentially wind that product down, that company down, and when I started Accomplice, there was a very specific goal, and we kind of went in with a specific problem that we were going to solve. So I would say that Accomplice has been in development, or what we do at Accomplice was only possible because I had spent the previous 3.5 years building similar or technology in the similar space, really understanding and learning from that, and then rebooting and coming back at the space with something that's truly valuable.
Right. Okay. So maybe let's talk about exactly what Accomplice does.
Absolutely. I always talk about what Accomplice does in the context of the problem that exists in the market. And so the problem that I always talk about is over the last 10 years we've seen a huge proliferation of channels in terms of how you reach consumers online. So if you rewind 10 years ago, it really was banner ads, so display advertising, and search engines. And then over the last 10 years, we've seen a proliferation of channels, a lot of it due to social, and then each one of those channels with their ad product. So we went from search engines and banner ads to now there's Facebook ads and Twitter ads and Instagram ads and Pinterest ads and LinkedIn ads, and Snapchat is rolling out ads, and Tumblr and so on. And this continues to only proliferate. As a marketer, in terms of the technology that you have available, most of that technology has been very reactive. So, Facebook ads launches, and then all of a sudden you have multiple or hundreds of third-party solutions to help you manage Facebook ads. And Twitter ads launches, and the same thing. And what ended up happening is you have each one of these channels being managed in a complete silo. So as a marketer, if let's say you have a $50,000 budget and you want to drive, whether it's app downloads or e-commerce purchases or whatever it might be, today there's a lot of manual work that happens in terms of thinking through how you should allocate your budget, building out campaigns and audiences, and then throughout the campaign process, you're launching and managing each one of these channels independently, using another solution like an analytics solution to kind of make sense of or get insights into, well, what is truly driving your actual conversions and the thing you care about, and what is it costing you, and then budget allocations are still done manually, so mixed models and things of the sort. So that's really the problem that Accomplice solves for, which is today to manage multiple paid channels is just a full-time job, and anyone who's actually stuck doing this, is spending hours upon hours jumping between different tools, analytics tools, using analysts to download all the data from each one of the individual channels and try to put together some sort of attribution story. So Accomplice solves for this. Today, Accomplice is the only solution that exists in market where you can set one budget with a goal. So you can tell the system, here's $50,000. I want to drive app downloads or app engagement or whatever it might be. Then we support multiple channels. You can build out your campaigns and audiences for each one, press a button, and what our system will do is not only set the bids and the budgets within each individual channel, optimize for performance there, but based on the performance in real time, it'll reallocate your budgets accordingly. So if it's seeing better performance from Facebook than Twitter, it'll shift money accordingly. Facebook to Google, and so on. And so what this really empowers the marketer to do is, worry less about, how do I actually manage the money once it's launched? How do I identify what are the best channels to drive the conversions? This essentially makes your marketing channel agnostic, where you can, be certain that there's a machine that, intelligently manages the money. It's always going to do it better, than humans can at scale, and that's really where the sweet spot is for our solution. So, that's the problem we solve, and that's kind of how it came about.
No, I think that's awesome, and I think that's kind of what fascinated me about your product is the fact that, I can set a budget, and then based on what's converting better, it kind of automatically moves, my budget around to the different networks, which I think you guys are the only ones doing it that I've seen, and I don't even think anybody's even doing anything remotely close to what you guys are doing. So that's why I wanted to have you guys on the show, because I think what you guys are doing is really, really awesome and super, super useful.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the interesting things is we always get asked, well, how did we pull this off? Or, how is it that no one else did? And we're talking about a space that's extremely crowded. You have 2,000 companies plus in the space that are, each trying to solve one part of the big challenge, and yet none of them has been able to bring to market a solution that does this specifically. And a lot of it really comes down to understanding what the technology is required to do. So, the approach that we took is we didn't just go out and build a tool to build your Facebook ads, your Twitter ads, your Google ads, and so on, but we built an entire analytics stack. So, in one system, we built a web analytics and mobile app analytics and user attribution suite, which serves as the one source of truth. So, what we're able to do because we have the analytics stack is we can create the campaigns, we can measure the results. There's a closed feedback loop there, where now because we have the user profiling stack behind the scenes, we can identify the same users as they interact with, let's say, a Facebook ad, a Twitter ad, a Twitter post, and whatever it might be. And then that, of course, informs the optimization. So we took a very holistic approach in terms of what the market needed. Instead of multiple tools, we kind of, we didn't reinvent the wheel. We took existing tools and how they're being used independently, brought them together, and the way that they're brought together and the optimization that sits on top of it, that's really the unique aspect of why we were able to pull this off.
Sure. No, I think that's really good. And just for the listeners out there, it's accomplice.io is the website, and I'll post it in the show notes as well as a few other links, but just for people listening, it's accomplice.io. So I'm curious to know some lessons that you've learned from kind of doing this startup and your previous startups, kind of good or bad.
Sure. Well, startups are quite the beast. I think that there's a quote that I once read where it talked about, what it feels like to be in a startup, and I think the way it described it was being in a startup or running a startup is kind of like essentially sitting on a line or riding a line where when you're on top of it and it's moving forward, it feels amazing, but then sometimes it'll turn around and just bite you. Startups are a very challenging. Any company really to get started is a startup, and that's always a challenging thing to do. I do work with a lot of startups in terms of just advising them and helping them think through their challenges. I would say that the one mistake that I usually see startups make more so than everything is just the validation process, right? There's so much importance in terms of before you get started, whether it's a food startup and you're making a meal or a technology startup and you're building a product, in terms of a startup, you have to make sure that whatever it is that you're building truly has a purpose and is truly solving a problem. And I see so many startups that, are building novel technology, but didn't really spend the time to validate up front and really do the research and identify, what is it that they're trying to solve, how valuable is it to whoever they're trying to solve for, and how much are they really willing to pay for it if they were willing to pay for it at all, right? So it's really the difference between being a vitamin or a painkiller. And I think that more so than all the other mistakes that I see startups make, that's the one that I think is most important. And what I've learned, and I've taken my own advice in terms of, I made a similar mistake in my previous companies where, I hadn't taken the time to truly validate, interview, talk to people, and make sure that, what I was solving was what needed to be solved. So I would say that's probably the most important lesson. At the end of the day, startups are just people, and I know people talk about this, and it sounds very cliched, but your team and the people that you get to do this with are everything, because there's always going to be ups and downs, there's always going to be challenges, but it really comes down to having the right people there, not only just to support you, but also pull off whatever the startup is trying to do that eventually defines the success.
No, I think those are really good, and I think people forget about that all the time. It seems like a lot of people just want to build these little, or turn like a feature into a company, and then they kind of wonder why they fail. So I think that's really good advice to validate an idea, and especially when you've been through it yourself, right?
Absolutely. There is a book that I always recommend called The 4 Steps to Epiphany. It's the Bible for thinking through, and I think that the context of the book is written in terms of kind of technology products, but you can apply that to anything, right? You can really apply the validation process and thinking through that to any business, and I can't overemphasize, how important that step is.
Is there any other tips that you'd give people for kind of validating their idea? Like, do you just ask friends and family online? Kind of, how do you go about validating an idea?
So, I would say validation has to be very contextual to whatever it is that you're trying to do. If you are, for example, in our case, right, with Accomplice, we were building a solution for marketers and a very specific type of marketer. So marketers that are, spending money online, required to do the analysis, the attribution, and so on. So, before we touched any line of code or even, thought about that, we spent about 3 months just interviewing hundreds of marketers and media buyers and media managers and media planners. And so, a lot of the research that we did was very contextual to the industry. So I would say, no matter what it is that you're trying to do, the validation should be very specific to that. So, if you're trying to, get a hair care line out, right, you're going to want to talk to people that work in salons or professional hair care that might get that feedback or provide that feedback to you. And the way that, validation, sometimes you don't even know what you're looking for, right? And so it's very important that when you design validation interviews out, right, the questions are broad but still very centered and contextual to what you're trying to solve. And it requires being an exceptional listener and really picking up on the challenges and understanding the workflow that someone is faced with, the challenges that are specific to that workflow, and then of course. Validation is not also a process that just ends at you do it at first and then you stop. Validation has to continuously happen as you're bringing something to market. Once you go through the first set of validation interviews, you might have a pretty good sense of what it is that you need to build. The next step then is to, start prototyping something. And as you do that, constantly getting the feedback, the validation, and making sure that, yep, this is exactly the direction that you're supposed to be going. This is what you're supposed to be solving. And if you do it and do it successfully, people will pay you money for it.
Oh, I think that's really awesome advice. So I'm curious then, is there anything that you wish you did differently with Accomplice, or just based on your history, you're pretty happy with how things are going so far?
I think as an entrepreneur, you have to learn not to have regrets and work and move forward. Personally, as an entrepreneur, I could tell you that I'm very much self-aware, and I audit everything I do on a regular basis. And so, there's not much I can look back and say, man, I really wish I did that different. Other than, I would say the biggest advice in terms of thinking through that would be, or at least from my experience, would be, sometimes when you don't have the right people, I wished I had let them go earlier rather than trying to find excuses or ways to make it work with them. And so, one of the important things that I always tell entrepreneurs is, what you got in the bank and the team that you have, that is really the only tools that you have. So you really need to make sure that A, you're spending your money right, and B, that you have the right people. And even if you have an inkling that the person that you have on your team, for whatever role it might be, is not the right person, you have that gut feeling where, you're not seeing the results, my most important advice is to cut your losses and rethink that component of your business. So, in terms of what I wish I had done differently, of course, validation, right? But I think that comes from a level of cognition and kind of experience. The second would be really, being able to identify what's working, what's not working in your business, and making decisions faster rather than finding excuses or trying to find ways to make it work. The third, I would say, is get your legal documents in order. So I actually have had a lot of experience with legal documents that I didn't have done right, and cost me a lot of time, effort, money, pain, and so I would say those are the three things that as I made mistakes as an entrepreneur, I look back and say, oh well, I probably should have done that differently.
I think you touched on a really important point here, is the legal documents. So what would you recommend to people that they should have kind of in place, kind of at the beginning and maybe even later on in a startup?
Sure. So, again, depending on what type of startup or company that you're trying to build, there's so much variation there, right? There's a great book that I read early on. I think it's called Venture Deals. I'm pretty certain that that's what it's called. But essentially, there's so many things to think through. What is the corporation structure? Is it an LLC, an S corp, a C corp? If you're going down the technology company route, it's typically going to be a C corp, so that you can have different types of stock. But the biggest mistakes always come down to contracts, right? And if you think about the purpose of a contract, the contract is supposed to be a formal document that outlines what each side of the agreement, what each party is going to be doing. And over the years, I've learned to think about contracts in the context of let's write out every single possible scenario, or within reason, of things that could go right and wrong, and then design the contract around that to address how both parties would want to deal with each one of those scenarios. So contracts should really have a purpose. I would say getting your corporate structure, and making sure that that's right is critical. But contracts can be everything in context of, having an employee with a vesting schedule, or a co-founder even with a vesting schedule, all the way to, how do you write the right type of contracts with customers to ensure that liability is shared across the board or on your end, depending on business, accordingly. So, contracts, I know a lot of entrepreneurs, just because there's so much typically that they have to do, sometimes they get overlooked or done improperly, or, corporate governance hasn't been kept up to date. I can't stress this enough. It's so critical to have, the right legal documents and really cleaned up corporate governance in place to scale and kind of operate a successful business.
No, I think that's really, really good advice, because you're right. I think a lot of people do forget about that, even especially early on, or if it's like two guys doing it kind of just in the evening, or girls, I should say.